the cyclical nature of climate change. The curve of the population of France since ancient times highlights successive periods of growth followed by impressive falls. The first phenomenon is a fairly high growth until about the year 350. The French population doubled between -100 BC and 300 AD. It then doubled between 800 and 1200 after. Finally, it doubled again between 1500 and 1900. The falls, in both intervals, correspond to major pandemics. These variations correspond to climatic changes observed by historians. The Roman era was a golden age. 60 years before Jesus Christ, Julius Caesar's Rome had only one stone temple. At the beginning of Nero's reign, the dwellings were still mostly of wood and Rome had a terrible fire. It has been rebuilt in stone and brick. Of course, all the temples and theaters were already made of stone. The city of Pompeii was made of stone and brick when the eruption of Vesuvius occurred in 79 CE. This prosperous period seems to have been characterized by high temperature and high humidity. Pliny the Elder reports that tollas were cultivated at unusual altitudes and latitudes. The rise of the beginning of the Roman imperial era was certainly due to climate change. Unlike cooling, which would be dramatic, warming increases agricultural productivity and therefore economic development. In fact, this favorable climatic episode was followed by an economic collapse. Before the end of the 2nd century, the terrible epidemic of the Antonine Plague ravaged the West. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, fighting east of the Roman Empire, was one of the first victims in 180. It was followed by two other epidemics in 249 and 541. The population collapsed. The Arab conquerors had no trouble invading the Middle East and the depopulated Maghreb. Yet the approach of the year 1000 shows an impressive recovery of the population, 1,000 years after that of the Roman era. If the growth of the Roman period begins to be related to the climate, that of the year 1000 undoubtedly results from a remarkable rise in temperature. The West was marked, around the year 1000, by an unprecedented economic and demographic development. At this time, there is an extraordinary evolution of tools, armaments and architecture. The proof is given by the Bayeux tapestry. In 1066, therefore, the helmets of the soldiers of William the Conqueror are no longer in bronze, but in iron. A favorable climate made it possible to exploit such unwelcoming areas as the slopes of the peaks of the Massif Central in France. They were subsequently abandoned and never exploited again. It seems that this warming was limited to the North Atlantic. This time marks the only colonization of Greenland, literally the Green Country, which has never been green thereafter. The Vikings settled there in number from 986. But, when the climatic disturbance of the time ended, they began to disappear, not being able to support the normal climate of this region. The Inuit, who live in these regions, are the only ones who can live there for a long time thanks to an adaptation of their bodies. The last descendants of the Vikings had disappeared 450 years after their landing on the island. At the beginning of the 14th century, intense cold waves could be detected in the core drilling of glacial zones. But the climate disruption had to stop long before. The fortress of Chateau Gaillard was taken by the armies of Philippe Auguste on March 6, 1204. During the winter, the inhabitants of the city below had to take refuge in the ditches. The English lacked to live. They refused to let them enter the fortress. All the inhabitants died of cold. This reversal of temperatures led, from 1347, a new epidemic even more terrible than the previous ones, the Black Plague. The population of Europe has fallen back to the maximum of the Roman era. It should be noted that these pandemics occurred during cooling down periods. It would be the bacillus of the plague, active in winter. The testimonies of the time make it possible to identify the Black Plague of 1347 and the Plague of Justinian in 541 with bubonic plague. The swelling of the ganglia, which is 80% lethal, is characteristic. But the symptom does not always exist, especially for previous epidemics that could result from the same bacillus before the final mutation of the amino acid 259 of the Bacillus Yersinia pestis. The fact is that the famous Rattus rattus invaded the west, to the most remote point of Scotland, nearly 1,000 years before our era. This black rat is a main vehicle of the bacillus that it transmits to fleas, propagators of the disease. We live today, a climate episode of the same order. No one doubts it. A greenhouse effect would result from methane released by cows and carbon dioxide emitted by our thermal plants and cars. To be precise, it must be said that the greenhouse effect is a phenomenon of convection in a glazed and closed room. The air is heated by the ground and goes up to replace the colder air at the top of the room. The circulation of the air can thus bring the temperature of the room to more than 50 degrees Celsius. In the atmosphere, the air heated by the ground rises, as in the greenhouse, but this heat is lost in the atmosphere. In my childhood, during meals, I heard my parents worry about the inexorable cooling of the planet. We talked about it in every newspaper. They described other planets in freezing temperatures. I was terrified. Our Brittany Spaniel, who was scratching at the window to enter, seemed to want to enjoy the warmth of the house before being transformed into a block of ice. The phenomenon invoked to explain the climatic disturbance has nothing to do with the convection of the air. It would be a phenomenon of radiation. Sunlight is absorbed by the soil and vegetation. Waves are then retransmitted at different frequencies. These waves are reflected by methane and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and return to warm the ground. An artificial satellite observed, a few years ago, a significant layer of methane above the forest of Laig, near Compiègne in the Oise. It was after a long time without wind. Where does methane come from? Leaves, branches, tree trunks and rotting roots. Almost as much methane. Moreover, the forests are dotted with glaucous ponds where emanations of methane escape bubbling. The mass of a beautiful tree of 20 years, taking into account the mass of leaves produced each year, is in tons. But the total mass of hay consumed in 20 years by a cow, in tens of tons, but it is necessary to remove the tons of dry matter from the milk. Milk gives little methane. Equivalents: a tree, a cow would certainly be very exaggerated, but there are at least 3 trillion trees on Earth. The unfortunate cows are only 1.5 billion. If open-air fermentation of leaves and dead branches produces carbon dioxide, those below or in water are deprived of oxygen. They methanize and give the forests a positive oxygen balance. The share of angels, to use the image of cellar master's cognac, the share of alcohol that evaporates from barrels. Without a part of methanization of leaves, dead branches, abandoned roots and trunks, the oxygen balance of the forests would be neutral insofar as the forest park is stable. The 3 occurrences of the Roman period, the year 1000 and the current period incite to attribute to the climatic disturbances a periodicity of about 1000 years. We must therefore try to go back in time. Of course, we find the flood of the Bible, but Plato, in the Laws, 3:677a, and Timaeus, 24th-25b, reports cyclical dramas that periodically brought humanity back to the deepest destitution. It is about deluges, epidemics of plague and many other plagues that would have practically destroyed humanity. The last occurrence mentioned would be a distant memory. Colds that cause outbreaks of plague occur about 200 years after warming. The memory may have been maintained for 300 or 400 years, according to the work of ethnologists on the oral transmission of traditions. Plato therefore referred to an epidemic that probably occurred around 750 BC, following a warming that would have marked the beginning of the first millennium BC. It is much more difficult to find this periodicity for the more distant past. The era of the Great Pyramids, with the countless necessary labor, does not seem to respect this period of 1,000 years. They were built between 2700 and 2200 BC. The mummy of Etsy, found on the border between Italy and Austria in 1991, lived 3,000 years before J.C. The temperature was, certainly, higher than until its discovery. In fact, the mummy has remained frozen without interruption until today, otherwise it would have rotted. Even the disruption of the year 1000 was not enough. And we are still far away, the Greenland valleys are not yet green. Nostalgic novels will have to wait. The mummy undoubtedly benefited, if I dare say, from a local treatment. The decline in the level of alpine glaciers began to accelerate as early as the 1970s, long before there was talk of global warming. Stonehenge in the UK was built a little earlier than the Great Pyramids, around 3000 BC, but it is a very rough dating based on the signs related to the use of the site rather than on its construction. The alignments of Karnak are even older. It is estimated that they date from 4500 to 3500 BC. The cairns of Gavernese and Barnes date from the same period. The so-called Proto-Celtic civilization flourished from 1200 BC to the end of the Bronze Age. The Celtic civilization of Hallstatt, corresponding to the beginning of the Iron Age, flourished from the year 800 BC. The huge terracotta army of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, dates back to 210 to 209 BC. All this leads to a cyclical phenomenon and therefore linked to astronomy, in particular to gravitation, which is probably not exclusively mathematical and invariant. The periodicity would be about 1,000 years. The current anomalous displacement of the Earth's magnetic pole could also be related to this phenomenon. The depressions seem to circulate more slowly and more irregularly than before. Modifications of this kind have been observed in the Middle East. It must be said that the circulation of the depressions remains very mysterious, especially if one thinks of the El Niño phenomenon. Scientists say that these changes in the circulation of depressions result from climate disruption. I say exactly the opposite. These changes are the cause of the current climatic disturbance, as it was the cause of the previous climatic disturbances. The pollution of the atmosphere that marks our era did not exist in previous episodes. Whatever the cause of climate change, we cannot continue to pollute the atmosphere and the oceans. By linking climate change to human activities, we risk turning away from the fight against pollution if this cause appears erroneous. The risk is the same when you mix all the problems. Fine particles constitute a health risk. Fine particles are likely to cause climate cooling.